Hello everyone, I'm Calypso Nicolaidis. I'm a fellow at this college and at the European Studies Center, as well as director of the Center for International Studies at DPIR. And I'm the convener of this event today, which in a way is a follow-up. Some of you may remember that in January, after the tragedy of the Charlie attack, we had this 8-person panel here in this very auditorium to discuss and trying to make sense, if that's the word, of the events and their implication and what it meant from a global perspective. Now, our colleagues, Tariq Ramadan and Eugene Rogan couldn't be there. Faisal was here with me and others. But a bit after that, what happened was I saw, as many of you in this room, that Tariq Ramadan published in collaboration with with 3 other co-authors, a very provocative call in the international press called Muslim Democrats of the World Unite. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs of this call, but before I do that, let me just, and let Tariq tell us more about it, let me just simply introduce the format of this event. Of course, we are kind of among ourselves. For St. Antony's Fellow, it's something that we take to heart, to talk across centers, across regions, among ourselves and with our colleagues and students. And so we hardly need to be introduced, but let me simply say that Tariq Ramadan is Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies here at this college and at Oriental Studies. And he has, of course, published many books, including with our very own OUP, What I Believe and Radical Reform, Islamic Ethics and Liberation. But, of course, he's a prolific writer on issues of Islam, identity, Europeanness, the relationship between Islam and the West, as well as most recently on the Arab Spring. But I would say, above all, for me, Tariq is a voice, Tariq is a bridge. Tariq is a person, perhaps uniquely able to speak to many audiences and to bridge their understanding, their worldview, while really holding not a wishy-washy kind of in-between position about the world, but very radical position, including on radical Muslim feminists, for instance. And indeed, he's also conveying these days a workshop from his program with the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, which is a collaborative center with Qatar, hosted by the Middle East Center on this side, on issues of gender and Islam. And he's been very active in trying to discuss within the Islamic community, but also with the world beyond, the messages of Islam on different topics. And so it's in the context of his, I would say, a journey and calling for establishing this voice, this Muslim voice in the world, this democratic Muslim voice, that this appeal appeared after Charlie Hebdo. And I am going to read to you what he writes with Felix Marquardt, Ghaleb Bencheikh, and Anwar Ibrahim. They write together, 10 February 2015. Since the end of the 19th century, the movement for critical reflection on the foundations and interpretations of Islam has lost momentum, impeded by the predominance of sclerotic, Arabo-centric Islam based on an obsolete worldview and often dismissive of non-Arab Muslims. Today, we solemnly call on Muslim leaders committed to democracy, whether political and religious authorities or intellectual theologians, to convene in France in early 2016 to define the contours of a progressive interpretation of Islam firmly grounded in the 21st century. It goes on for a page and a half. So those of you who haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it because it continues to be indeed very provocative. And in the end, they say the time has come to turn the tables on the hijackers and set a new course for Islam in the 21st century. Our future as peace-loving Muslim democrats is at stake. So the question before us with this school, Tariq, is, well, what led you to write it with these authors? What is your thinking about its importance and what's at stake? But also to share with us what kind of reactions you have elicited since it came out in February. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your voice on this call. And we're also very much looking forward to our two discussants, who also don't need to be introduced as they are our colleagues here. Faisal Devji, who, as you know, is director of the Asia Center. And his last book, of course, is totally topical here, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea. Not a provocative title at all, of course. And indeed, Eugene Rogan, who is Professor of Modern History here of the Middle East, and is also director of the Middle East Center, as you all know. And his last book is The Arabs: A History. But you finished a new book since then.
I have actually.
But it's not published.
It is published.
It is published. It is out. So I shouldn't say the last book again.
It's okay.
Your last book.
The Fall of the Ottomans.
The Fall of the Ottomans is, of course, out. Thank you. Not that we don't care about the Ottomans in the European Center where we study the neo-Ottomans, as it were. So anyway, without further ado, let me turn to Tariq, who is going to now tell us about Muslim Democrats of the World Unite.
Thank you, Calypso, for this introduction and putting this meeting together here this afternoon. Let me say a few things as an introduction, because it has a history and not coming from nowhere. And of course, it's connected to the reactions that we got after Charlie Hebdo and the way we had to take a stand just after this. And I think that Charlie Hebdo, not as something which is specific, because it happened even here in 2005 after 7/7, that things were revealing and some concerns and challenges. And I think that it's important to go deep in this understanding, because at the end, I wrote this calling Muslims to be vocal and calling the silent majority to stop being silent. But at the same time, I'm turning to my fellow Western citizens to say, you can't keep quiet. You have a shared responsibility in the whole thing. And this is also where I think the discussion should start. It's not only good to have Muslims calling for democracy, it's calling all of us for more consistency in what we are talking about when it comes to principles, to values, and to living together. So this is also what I said. If you remember, I was very much involved after 7/7. I was called by, at that time, Tony Blair, the task force, and asking us to be involved. I say, yes, that's fine, I'm ready to be involved with one condition. I should be able to speak my mind, to be free, because what he was saying and pushing is, it's your business, you Muslims, you have to solve it, and the rules of the game have changed. And I said, look, if we are serious about what happened in London at that time, which is exactly what I repeated in France, is that these young Muslims are the children of two parents. And when somebody is going astray, you don't only blame one parent by saying it's the fault of the mother or the father. They are British Muslims as much as they are French Muslims, and we have to deal with the issue understanding here that yes, there are something to be said when it comes to the wrong understanding of Islam and to betray the Islamic principles, but they were born and raised in France, and we have also to deal with social issues, and not to justify, but to try to understand. And to understand doesn't mean that you are justifying. Condemning was a principle for me from the very beginning, but that's not possible just to say, okay, condemn and shut up. No, condemn and explain and try to understand. And this is something that was, in fact, the logic that we had even after September the 11th. You are with us, against us, so you condemn you Muslims, and then you do the job among Muslims just to criticize Muslims, and it's as if there is no responsibility coming from the West, no responsibility coming from Britain, no responsibility coming from the French society. And I think that is not going to solve the problem. So my call with this is to be very critical with Muslims, but also calling for us to come together and to respond to some of or at least to address some of the challenges, and to take a stand that is consistent and principled. So now, just something which is important because it gives you the background of this call coming from Muslim Democrats, which started with this. Just after what happened in Paris, our position, my position, was straight away to condemn what happened in the name of two things. The first is freedom of expression as a principle, and second, of course, condemning the killing of the people. This should have been clear from the very beginning. But the very following day, just the day after it happened, I was interviewed by a Swiss TV mainstream program, the news, and they were asking me, "Are you Charlie?" And I said, "No, I'm not Charlie." And because this was my feeling, I was not Charlie. And then I came back to France. The following day I was traveling to France, and my publisher told me, "You know what? All you said was good except this. I didn't get it. It was not bearable for me." And I listened to what because she was very supportive of a book that I just finished, but she was telling me, "No, it's not understandable." I understood here that we have to be very cautious with something which was a sincere emotional reaction coming from people. That you cannot just say, "I'm not Charlie," and not explain. So, straight after this, I make it clear. If you mean by being Charlie to condemn the killing and to support freedom of expression, yes, I am. But if you mean by being Charlie to support this sense of humor, the way they are doing it, I never supported that. So, it's something which is to be clear about, because Charlie ended up being everything, to the point that now we don't know what it means to be Charlie. And you had a book that was published last 2 weeks ago by Emmanuel Todd that is a big controversy now in France because it said the 11th of January was a fake. It was wrong. So now there is another step on this. But I think that on this, it's quite important to be clear on this, and I think that our responsibility as Western Muslims and take it as something which is important because everything is interconnected now. It's exactly what I started to be involved in the discussion with the Salman Rushdie affair by saying the Salman Rushdie fatwa is not a religious fatwa; it's a political fatwa, and I was against it from the very beginning. And then with the Danish crisis, and then what happened in the Netherlands, to be quite clear that if we should be clear on freedom of expression. But talking to Muslims and saying you have to take an intellectual critical distance and to understand that you might not like it, but you have to deal with it, and you cannot respond with violence. And in fact, if you just study with facts and figures what happened in the West and in Europe with all this, the great majority of the Western and European Muslims were very wise with their reaction. It didn't come from Europe, it came from Pakistan, it came from people playing and instrumentalizing the whole issue outside. But the Danish Muslims did not react for 4 months. And then there is something which means here that something is nurtured and experienced by European and Western Muslims that is going to be very important for the future. In fact, what I said in the beginning of the 19th, it's our Western experience will have a tremendous impact in Muslims in Muslim majority countries. If and only if Muslims are not isolated themselves from the society, and if their fellow citizens are not pushing them to respond to things that are done by Muslims and not being involved in the discussion in a consistent way. Not to put them on the defensive, and I think that this is where the shared responsibility starts. Now, what happened in Paris was revealing again what we had in Denmark and the Netherlands before, and Western Muslims, by and large, reacted in a way which was responsible and wise. Now, from where we are, and this is where it started, I was traveling, I was in Malaysia, with Anwar Ibrahim, who now is in jail and for things that he, anyway, I don't want to enter in this, but I was with him, and Felix was there, and this is why I say, okay, look, there is a problem here, and we have to take a stand, and not only to take a stand, but to be quite strong in some of our statements about the future Muslims. Meaning that all what the confusion that we have now, that the only Muslim voices that are heard are coming from the Arab world, and in fact this is not the majority of the Muslims around the world, that we have an understanding in Asian countries, in Western countries, in African countries, and we have to have these voices coming together. Not without the Arab voices, but not having the exclusive majority Arab voices being heard around the world, and to say, okay, look, now we have to come with a critical take and to be self-critical. It's not self-critical to please the West, self-critical to improve our own understanding and to move on, which is exactly what I have been doing for the last 30 years. Radical reform is a call for Muslims to wake up. It's just now. You cannot blame the world. You have to come back to yourself and reassess our reading of the scriptural sources, our reading of some of the principles, but only something which is also very important, which is the essential notion of freedom of expression. And freedom of expression should be debated here, but it's something which we know is essential in Muslim majority countries, and our answer as Muslims about it is not clear. On all sides, so to speak. I would say, if you look at and the book, The Arab Awakening, I'm very critical about the Islamist stand on freedom of expression. But it's exactly the same with secular. It's not because you are religiously liberal that you are a Democrat. We have secularists supporting dictatorships in Muslim majority countries. So the point here is also to promote this discussion and to call all the citizens to come to a better understanding and to be consistent with the principle, and this is our responsibility. So as a Western European Muslim, I feel that we have a responsibility to be involved in this discussion at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. Meaning traveling around the world, talking about it, having this call and say, okay, people now you have to come to this discussion, which has to do with first the way we are dealing with our tradition, the way we are dealing with our principles, and the way today there is clearly something which is missing, that there is a crisis within the Muslim majority countries as well as the Muslim communities, and one of the most important one is the crisis of authority. And if we talk about authority, you talk about democracy. How do you get this voice? Who has the right? Who should speak in the name of Muslims around the world? So this kind of opening the discussion is something which is essential. And as you can expect, some had this reaction, say, oh, that's it. You are promoting democracy, in fact, because you are supporting the West against us. And you speak as a Western Muslims or European Muslims, as if not only you are critical towards the Arabs, which was a very biased way of reading the text, because it's not what we are saying exactly, but more than that, you are taking a side, and by being a Western, you are more Westerner than you are Muslim. And this is where we have to respond to this by saying, no, that has nothing to do with this. It's in the name of Islam and in the name of our tradition. So this internal discussion is also something which is very important. As a Western Muslim or European Muslim, I'm not only talking with Europeans, I'm talking with fellow Muslims, and this is one of the most important challenges in recent years. And you can see it around the world. But I would tell you something, and to say something to all the people of other faiths or with no faith. You are not spectators on this. You are not spectators of an internal Muslim dialogue. The more consistent our fellow citizens are going to be with principles, the more effective it's going to be within the Muslim community. Because it's connected. It's connected. Because one of the most important criticism I got is the West doesn't care about democracy. It's double standard. So when it suits the West, they are for it. but when it's not in the interest of the West. So I can understand that this is a take on governance. What about the citizens? And I will come to this to my conclusion where I am coming within my 20 minutes. So when I was asked to condemn, I was once in a radio program in France, and I was condemning and saying, and we have to add different things. And the journalist told me, oh, that's always the same with you, Tariq Ramadan. It's always yes, but. And I told him, no, the coordinating conjunction is wrong. It's yes and. And means it's complex. Don't ask me to take a stand and not come to understanding what is happening. So you don't do this because I'm not going to just condemn and say yes because you are expecting from me to say yes and there is no other explanation. Why I was saying this? Because for us, Europeans, all of us here as Europeans and whatever is our take on this is the starting point of our discussion about democracy, if we are serious, is to refuse any kind of double standard within our society and outside. That's the starting point. And my take with Charlie is to say, how come when it's against Islam, you speak about freedom of expression, but one of your journalists did something and said something about the Jewish tradition, criticizing the son of Sarkozy, and he was fired within 24 hours. How come? Why do you have this double standard? You are not going to be taken seriously if, in one side, you promote freedom of expression, on the other side, you fire the people in the name of, we cannot say everything in the name of freedom of expression. The same guy who said, I'm supporting freedom of expression with Muslims or against Muslims, was saying, no, you can't say everything. And one of them, by the way, was Bernard-Henri Lévy, that you know very well. So he's not from Charlie Hebdo, but this is the way he was supporting this. So I think that this is where, if we want to support this, it's important to come with a consistent, and we have to be allies on this, no double standard, and not to let freedom of expression be used by political forces that are using it with xenophobic and sometimes very Islamophobic stand in their discussion. Now, the other thing which I think it's important when it comes to this, it's we really have, from where we are, after Charlie Hebdo, and when we speak about democracy, understand that in the West, or in Europe, in our countries, now, for example, in the UK, or in France, or in the Muslim majority countries, when we speak about democracy, we should not speak only about the structural understanding of democracy. Democracy means there are conditions. And this is where, when it comes, for example, in our society about education, I'm sorry, you can speak in so many ways about democracy in France, but if we are not serious about the school system in the suburbs in France, that are pushing now some of the young people to be on the margin of the society, you speak about democracy, but you are not speaking about the conditions of democracy. So this is why we have to come together. And for me, it's a call to say to the Muslims, we have to reread our text, but to come to all of us, we have to be consistent with the conditions of democracy. It has to do with education. It has to do also with a clear understanding that when we speak about the secular system is not against religion. The secular system is to help all the religions to live together. So this is where we can't be silent with this. And as much as now the far-right parties or the populist parties, UKIP or the Front National, they are now pushing in a way where in the name of the secular system and even in the name of democracy, they are supporting principles and they are supporting positions that are against, in fact, equal citizenship and democratic processes. And even supporting, I'm sorry, I was very critical towards the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I was, and it's written, but the silence of the international community after the coup d'etat and people being sentenced to death with this silence, how come are you going to be taken seriously by the Muslim majority countries if you are silent where a Democrat, or at least the democratic process, put in as a president, somebody, we may don't like him, but we should support the process, at least the process. And our silence is problematic. And I would say this is not helping the democratic call in Muslim majority countries. Even, for example, with what happened in Malaysia, by the way, with Anwar. Sometimes our silence, it's problematic. So to come to what I wanted to say here is that this call is a two-way process. It's coming to the Muslims say, we can't blame the West. This is our responsibility, intellectual responsibility, moral responsibility, political responsibility to call for democracy, consistency, and to struggle for it, meaning to struggle for the conditions of democracy, not only the structural side of democracy. That's a very important. Education, equality between men and women, culture, all these things are part of the process. And for example, to celebrate something which is a problem for me as a Muslim is that the great majority of the Muslim countries, anything which has to do with imagination, arts, there is no production, there is no creativity. I don't see democracy without creativity, arts, and imagination. So this is also something where I'm calling the Muslims to take it, but on the other side, to make you understand that it's a shared responsibility, and not only coming from the government, it's coming from the citizens. And the citizens, it means here that we have to be serious about this. I'm sorry to say that I'm calling the silent majority of the Muslims to be less silent. And the problem with the silent majority is they're silent. But I would say the same to my fellow citizens throughout the West. Your silence is a problem. If we are not coming to consist, if you want to support democratization and the democratic spirit everywhere, you can't be a silent citizen. In fact, it's a contradiction in terms. A silent citizen is not exactly the citizen I am expecting from our democratic societies. Thank you.
Thankfully, I believe that we have with us for this conversation today citizens from many, many countries who are certainly not in the habit of being silent. So we're looking forward to your reactions. Before that, let me turn to Eugene.
Vice, do you have a preference? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I confess that in the aftermath of the January events in Paris, I refused every invitation to speak on the Charlie Hebdo killings. I had an experience very similar to the one that Tariq Ramadan has described. Having read Charlie Hebdo for many years with friends who subscribed and upheld its humor and satire as part of French values, I had a long-running argument about Charlie Hebdo. It was a magazine I had distasteful for a long time now, not just for being hostile to Islamic values, but it's a racist, sexist, arrogant, nasty magazine. And I've just liked it for many years now. So I had the clumsiness after the attacks to resume the discussion about Charlie Hebdo with my French friends, as though it were an appropriate thing to do, and it was not, because I had underestimated the extent to which, for people in France, this assault went very, very deep indeed. And so I wound up making a number of apologies to friends that I had quite unwillingly offended. And I shut up. I just let everyone else do the talking for a little while. It was, after all, one of those issues on which I could afford to sit back and take it at a distance. So this is the first time I've agreed to speak on the issue.
Well, thank you.
Well, I felt there was enough time had passed. And there's always a temptation to share a platform with Tariq Ramadan. Not because it's particularly fun. Let's be honest. You want to share a platform with someone that you disagree with. But I have always found in my discussions with my esteemed colleague that I so agree with him. And I fear that tonight is no exception. In fact, as I was making little notes about what I intended to say, I find that he is systematically stealing me of my thunder, which just confirms that it's not always fun to share a platform with Tariq Ramadan. I would just wish to reiterate his call, speaking here as an American scholar working at a British university with a quarter century's experience as an academic and, in that sense, a public intellectual, that the calls made by Muslim Democrats to protect the values they hold dear should only put new pressure on Western Democrats to meet them wholeheartedly in that enterprise. If we are to create a 21st century where coexistence and mutual respect is the dominant discourse rather than a clash of civilization that we all dismissed at the end of the 20th century as one of Samuel Huntington's worst ideas.
So, how can we in the West be good Democrats? Well, I just want to echo what you said about double standards.
I mean, I think first and foremost, consistency is the hallmark of integrity. And so when it comes to that fundamental principle of democratic rule, which is not that the majority gets to win because they win the vote, but that the winners of the vote have the responsibility to look out for the minority community. You judge a democracy by its approach to minority rights first and foremost. That there can be absolutely no scope for double standards in the treatment of minorities, to have those that are respected and those that are not. Those about whom we can say anything and those about whom we can only say certain things. And I think in that, again, targeting the double standard held between the incitement to hatred, the derision that is tolerated of Islam in Europe, but is not tolerated of Judaism in Europe, is a double standard which undermines our democracy. And it is something that we must address by looking squarely in the mirror and saying we have a double standard we must stop. We must show the same degree of tolerance, not just towards Islam, but literally towards every minority community that has come to the shores of our countries, drawn by the political power of our ideas, and our ideas are of long standing, they go back to the Enlightenment, we value them dearly, but we don't always uphold them with consistency, with the consistency they deserve. And if we're going to ask our minorities to be good Democrats in the Western context, then we Westerners have the same responsibility. I think that that responsibility goes towards the press. That must really weigh very carefully the way it approaches sensitive issues. I do not wish to focus uniquely on the way the press treats Islam, but the choice of the language used, the inevitable pairing of the word radical with Muslim, the completely misguided generalization made about one faith community in which the acts of a distinct radical fringe minority are in some way made the moral burden of the law-abiding good citizen majority, is something that drives the sale of newspapers or brings ratings to TV news, but is irresponsible in the extreme. And I know too many good journalists would agree with that, to feel like I'm being, an academic making a cheap shot. It is something that needs to be addressed with great concern, because the free press, to be free, must speak with a voice that is equally respectful to everybody in a democracy. And if we are in any way aiding and abetting this sort of conflict of values, then I think holding our press to account with the very same degree of scrutiny that, let us say, Friends of Israel hold the press to when it comes to their coverage of that country is something that we should all be aware of. I think it's very important that the relationship between the majority and minority populations in a Western democracy must be based on dialogue. So when I hear people saying to people like Tariq Ramadan, you Muslims must, without adding to that, what is it you Muslims want us to do to help make the situation better? Then we are dealing with dictate rather than dialogue, and our democratic values are undermined as a result. We have a terrible responsibility here as we respond in anger to acts of extremists, to remember at all times that all acts of extremism are to some degree a reflection of things that we've gotten wrong. And no, this is not a liberal self-flogging to try and justify violence. I in no way justify violence. I abhor it, as does my most conservative critic. But the fact of the matter is not to recognize in all political situations it takes two to create a crisis. And that the role that we in the West play in that requires dialogue to resolve it just seems fundamentally obvious to me. The fact that the failure of dialogue keeps making things worse and worse and worse suggests that there really must be a better way of going about engaging. And I would be a strong advocate for dialogue as an extension of democratic values we all hold dear.
Don't tell the Muslims what they must do without next asking Muslims what they think we must do if we're to resolve the kinds of situations that Charlie has brought to light. Last, and I think most delicate, is at what point do we recognize that Islam really is a part of Europe? At what point do we say that Muslim communities have reached such a critical mass that they are allowed to have an impact on the culture of Europe? We continue to talk as though there is a deep cultural divide, as though there's Europe and then there's Islam. And we really want Islam to come around to accepting Europe. You know, we got these values and they've got to stand by it, they come into our place and all that stuff. That's fine. If you're dealing with immigrants who are coming in on work visas and have a citizenship somewhere else. But when you're dealing with communities that are many generations enrooted in this society and who are reaching a critical mass of 7% or 9% or 11%, at some point the majority community must accept that as an extension of democratic principle, they have a right to have an impact on our societies, whether it is going to be in the urban fabric, and here I'm thinking of the demented Swiss referendum to ban minarets in a country that had seen 2, or the debates that went on in Oxford about whether or not building an Islamic center that would have a minaret-style tower represented, you know, the Muslim wave overtaking British values. You know, this sort of xenophobic response to what is now a deeply enrooted, many generations old, very sizable minority community must make us all take pause if we're not to turn democracy into a tyranny of the majority and fail in that primary responsibility. Not just to be tolerant, but respectful of the minority communities in our societies. So I would really want to repeat many of the things that Tariq said by putting the onus very squarely on Western Democrats to make our democracy one to which we have a right to try and urge Muslims to show full respect and adherence. And if I were to then make one feeble attempt to call on you Muslims, it would be to mobilize within the legal institutions of the democratic system to be more effective in fighting their corner too. I think that far too often the loudest voice heard is the most marginal when it comes to Muslim communities in Europe. That the silent majority that you refer to, Tariq, needs to be much more politically savvy. Not to make me happy, but to defend their rights more effectively, to convey a more balanced sense of what Islam's place is in Europe, or in Britain, or in France, or in any other country. That if there's a responsibility Muslims owe, it's not to the rest of us in the democracy, it is to themselves and their community to use the tools that are readily at their disposal as they are to the disposal of anybody who wishes to be politically engaged and defend their rights in the system, but to do so intelligently, effectively, to preserve their place as a minority community that deserves a far better deal at the hands of Western democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Khlass, for organizing this, and thank you, Tariq and Eugene, for your eloquent comments, which I want to follow up on by pointing out that conversation or dialogue, as Eugene puts it, requires, of course, both parties, and there might be more than two, to be particulars. Neither one can represent the universal and submit the other only to particularity. And the problem with so much debate and discussion on, say, Charlie Hebdo has been the elimination of particularity and therefore the elimination of dialogue. The claim to the universal, which I think is very, very damaging. In fact, this happens to Charlie Hebdo itself. Here, a magazine of great particularity and distinctiveness and singularity suddenly became a pious member of the establishment of something generic and universal. The irony should not be lost on us, I think, that even that singular voice was elevated into an expression of universal values. Right? And of course, one way in which this happens is by privileging the idea of law. Right? And indeed doing so in such a way as to speak in the name of the state as the author of law. So rather than speaking as any kind of particularity, many of those who either supported Charlie Hebdo or condemned Muslims, and the two are not the same thing, would speak universally in the following manner. We don't know who, what the content of the we is. We should have, free speech entails the following. They spoke for the state, in the name of the state, and in doing so, resiled from any notion of their own particularity, and therefore made any kind of dialogue impossible. I think that is crucial, and it's very, very problematic, because of course such a universalistic position necessarily ignores both history and sociology, both of which deal with particularities. And as a historian, I cannot ever forget that. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by saying this about the universal. So you have among a number of the defenders of free speech a bizarre narrative which is far more backward-looking and unchanging than the Islamic narratives they profess to challenge. Because this narrative inevitably went back to a mythical time of the wars over religion, interpreted mythically, I don't mean the wars are mythical, and how this must serve as a model in which to rethink Muslim participation in European societies. Why that should be the case, why that point of Western European history should become the important point, the important model for everyone else, was never and is never explicated. Together with this, of course, you have also the introduction by some of the speakers for some of the upholders of free speech of particularly theological categories, which are not necessarily in evidence even among those Muslims who protested either Charlie or the satanic verses or the Danish cartoons. And I'm speaking here of the category of blasphemy itself, which from the Rushdie affair onwards was of course taken from Christianity. And that many of the Muslims, rightly or wrongly, who protested, sometimes illegally and violently protested, say the satanic verses, did not in fact rely upon the language of blasphemy. They didn't have it. They used the secular language wrongly, nevertheless in a secular manner, of offense, of libel, of denigration, of insult, and they still do it. So where the blasphemy comes in, it's smuggled in from Christian history. And sometimes Muslims themselves revert to Christian history to rescue that idea. So where the theology is coming from, and where the backwardness and unchanging nature of the narrative lies, is actually very complex. And I would suggest that it comes from the universalistic position itself, in its legalistic language. There is, of course, a difference, and this is where we must also attempt to particularity, between what happened in the Rushdie affair, for instance, and what has happened most recently with Charlie Hebdo, to say nothing about the attacks in Texas recently, right? On the one hand, of course, we can put these all in a single continuum, and they do belong together. They belong together because in all of these cases, it's an insult supposedly delivered to Muhammad, the Prophet, that is meant to create outrage. But of course, all of these events also occur at rather different historical conjunctures and have rather different consequences. So the satanic verses controversy emerges at the very moment that the Cold War ends and a new global arena is created, an arena in which Islam suddenly assumes a certain kind of global identity for practically the first time through media, through television in particular, in this manner. Right? People imitating each other on television, etc. By the time you get to Charlie Hebdo, of course, you find, and Tariq pointed this out, apart from Pakistan and Niger, there is no global protest. There is no global outrage. Right? The Muslim world is not interested, as far as I can tell. And neither are the European Muslims so much, as Tariq also pointed out. So something has changed. There is a continuum. These events are linked to each other in various ways. They play off each other. And one of the differences, I think, here is that it is precisely because there is no popular upsurge against Charlie Hebdo in the Muslim world that you can have these kinds of killings. Right? The popular upsurges did not lead to, of course, the translators of Rushdie's satanic verses in 1, 2, or 3 occasions were killed. And it would be interesting to find out more details about that. We are never told. But in this particular case, for the first time, the upsurges over insults to the Prophet were twinned for the first time with militancy and jihadism. There hadn't been in the past, in my view. Not in the Rushdie affair, not in the Danish cartoons. In fact, if you recall, during the controversy over the Danish cartoons, Al-Qaeda was put completely on the back foot. They were marginalized because the protests over the Danish cartoons did not use jihadi language and did not refer to Al-Qaeda. So it took people like Zawahiri to try to, claw back there are two kinds of movements here, in other words. And the one we have just seen with Charlie Hebdo operates in a rather different way from the one we saw, say, with the satanic verses. But a universalistic position and narrative doesn't allow one to understand this or to even recognize it. You have to be, as Tariq was saying, you cannot even be heard out of that legalistic, universalistic, from that position. So I want to conclude then by talking about rights and duties, because of course the language of law and its universalist position is all about rights. Right? The right to free speech, the right to offense, the right to all of those things. But taking a leaf out of someone who I have worked on, Gandhi, one might suggest that to conceive or subordinate all social relations to the name of the law, under the law, is to create a tyranny. That social relations cannot be defined entirely by law. They must occur without, outside, beyond, underneath the law, to be truly social relations. You cannot define friendship or love by law. Right? You might have laws regarding to, relating to, say, marriage, but those are held to be somewhat distinct from the love that is also meant to define a marriage, for instance. Without privileging law, therefore, and therefore rights, it's only without privileging law and rights and the language of rights, which can never define all the social relations, that ethical relations, conversations, and dialogue become possible. Otherwise, I think they are impossible. And this is where duty comes in. Gandhi was famously said on more than one occasion, I'm not interested in rights, I'm interested in duties. Duties are what define social relations. Right? A right can be taken away from you. You might think you have an inherent right, but the state actually controls that right and guarantees that right. But your duties no one can take away from you. Those belong to you. Each person has a duty. Now, a lot of the language of offense, of Muslim offense, meaning Muslims feeling offended, draws upon, perhaps perversely, ideas of duty rather than ideas of right. And that might constitute a site of meeting, of conversation, of dialogue. Not to legalize everything, to actually think about social relations and therefore dialogue in a way that is social, that does not force anyone to speak in the name of the state, that is not all about law, because when you think about the legalistic notion of free speech, which presumes no duties that people should actually defend each other, should talk to each other, even if they have different views, then how are you going to achieve a peaceable society and a harmonious society? You can only achieve it in this vision through some idea of an invisible hand. Right? Everyone has rights, and you insist on those rights, and then somehow, like the invisible hand of Adam Smith, you will end up with a harmonious society. I don't think it works much with Adam Smith, and I certainly don't think it works here. Because, and I will end here, free speech and all such legally defined practices are, at the end of the day, determined by convention. And that's not a bad thing. That's why they change. That's why things change. And convention only becomes convention if it implies dialogue and conversation across the social field. It will never be ideal, but I think it is necessary, it must be necessary. Otherwise, you have the imposition of rights that destroys the very social fabric that it's meant to protect. And I'll stop there.